Welcome to Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute, hosted by Georgina Downer. Hello, and on today's episode of Afternoon Light, I am talking to Bridget Griffen-Foley, who is from the Centre for Media History at Macquarie University and is the author of many books on the history of Australian media, but particularly on Sir Frank Packer, which was published by Sydney University Press. It's lovely to have you on Afternoon Light today, Bridget.
Good to be with you, Georgina.
And today, Bridget, we're going to speak about, of course, the history of the media in Australia, but particularly as it relates to Sir Robert Menzies, so that period in the 1940s, 50s and 60s. And it's amazing reading some of your works, just how things really haven't changed, isn't it?
That's right. There's been a very long nexus between media organisations and politicians and political parties for a long time.
Absolutely. It'd be interesting, Bridget, to start our conversation for you to paint a picture of who were the key players in the Australian media landscape in the 1940s, because the names are pretty familiar.
The names are familiar. They really haven't changed that much. So there was the Fairfax dynasty, the longest established since the 1840s, had been publishing what we know as the Sydney Morning Herald. In addition to that, there were two 20th century dynasties that emerged. One was the dynasty headed by Sir Keith Murdoch. I use dynasty in a slightly sort of hesitant sense because Murdoch controlled a lot of newspapers and also radio stations through the Herald and Weekly Times, but he didn't actually own a lot. He was a very powerful manager and player, but when he died in 1952, he actually didn't leave very much to his son, Rupert Murdoch, so that's another whole story. And then there's the Packer Media dynasty, which was really established by a journalist from Tasmania called R.C. Packer. And by the 1930s, his son, Frank, had moved into launching the Australian Women's Weekly, which was to become the best-selling magazine in Australia. And also in 1936, his company, Consolidated Press, took over the publication of what was then called The Telegraph, renamed it The Daily Telegraph, and that continues today. So by the 1940s, you have the Fairfax, the Murdoch and the Packer dynasties in place as the largest and most powerful commercial media proprietors in Australia.
And it seems, doesn't it, it's like the tale of two cities as well. You had the Melbourne Murdochs and then the Sydney Packers and Fairfaxes. It's interesting how bifurcated it was. Those sort of colonial pre-federation lines existed, until very recently, really.
Yes, that's right. And of course, with federal parliament initially sitting in Melbourne, that gave Keith Murdoch and the Melbourne Herald Group a particular influence and sway over politics, and partly through what became known as Collins House. And then there's the much brasher Packers in Sydney, who are seen very much as new money, engaged in turf warfare, engaged in literally fisticuffs at times. And then there's Fairfax is very much sort of old money but in Sydney, interestingly.
So prior to Menzies becoming Prime Minister for the first time in 1939, Keith Murdoch is quite the media figure and incredibly involved in politics, which I found quite interesting in relation to the Conservative side and the movement of Joe Lyons from the Labor Party to the UAP. Can you describe to me what was going on there with Keith Murdoch really in the background or not even in the background?
That's right. In the early 1930s, Keith Murdoch and the Melbourne Herald political correspondent Joe Alexander very involved in luring Lyons across to the United Australia Party. And Lyons is, by the 1930s, you start seeing cartoons appear of Keith Murdoch as a sort of marionette controlling, what was now sort of politics in Canberra. So Murdoch also had been schooled to some extent by Lord Northcliffe after World War I in the early years of the 1920s. And his nickname, or one of Keith Murdoch's nicknames, was Lord Southcliffe, someone who wielded political power probably more with a rapier than with perhaps the shovel that Frank Packer and Kerry to some extent would become known for.
So Lord Northcliffe was a figure in the British press. I guess we should explain that for our listeners.
Yes, that's right. A tremendously powerful 20th century newspaper baron.
Yep.
His publications did include the Times, but also a number of tabloid newspapers. And, well, there were really in Britain two dominant newspaper barons in the first half of the 20th century, Beaverbrook and Northcliffe. And Northcliffe was the one who really was something of a patron of the young Keith Murdoch after World War I.
It's interesting, Bridget, once Joe Lyons does move over to the United Australia Party, he's Prime Minister, but then he has this falling out with Menzies. It's over an issue to do with an election promise around national insurance, and Menzies feels like the Lyons government is not standing by its commitment to the electorate. But it's interesting how Keith Murdoch then shifts from Lyons to Menzies and starts to build up Menzies as a figure who should take over.
Yeah, I mean, there's sort of waxing and waning, I think, of the relationship with Menzies. I mean, the Menzies that we think of in 1940 to 41 is very different from the Menzies that would, start to emerge along with the Liberal Party in the 1940s, but then really become a sort of dominant figure from the late 1940s. He's a much more steady, proven quantity, I think, in 1940. And while he was known for his brilliance at the bar, for his eloquence, there's a considerable degree of leadership instability in 1940 to 41. And as Rod Tiffin and other scholars would argue, the media loves leadership instability and can really...
sells a few papers.
Indeed, sort of... That's right, and really fan the flames of that instability. And of course you have in 1940 to 41 the conflagration of World War II. The war is not going well in Europe or in Asia for the Allies. There's controversy over Menzies spending some 4 months overseas on the sort of international war stage, but there's controversy about him not being in Australia in those early months of 1941 at the same time as people within his party and within the coalition are sort of agitating against him. So the press proprietors by 1941 are sort of feeding into and fanning that instability. And some media groups are concerned about the fact that there's really a minority government that's in office from the election of September 1940. There's two independents that are basically keeping the government afloat. And yet the main party, the UAP, is experiencing this kind of leadership instability. So there's something of a sort of perfect storm for press proprietors to be saying, look, we need a national government, and to be questioning the leadership of R.G. Menzies.
But at this stage, at least, Murdoch is still supportive of Menzies' leadership and at least the continuation of conservative side of politics being in power, even if it would be some sort of national government. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. Look, the Sydney Morning Herald and the Daily Telegraph in Sydney were unhappy with Menzies' leadership, but it is fair to say by those later months of 1941 that the Melbourne Herald and Murdoch are unhappy. It doesn't mean that they want a Labor government, but they're unhappy with Menzies' leadership.
I found it extraordinary, Bridget, to read that Menzies, I think it's Menzies, he appoints Murdoch as Director of Information in 1941. So Murdoch's a newspaper key figure in the Australian newspaper scene. Is he managing editor of the Herald? Powerful person,
yes,
and presumably independent, but then he's employed by the government as Director of Information, short-lived Director of Information because it doesn't suit him really.
That's right. So he's appointed Director General of Information. Interestingly, Frank Packer actually becomes head of an organisation called the Allied Works Council. So you see influential press proprietors who are used, especially in the case of Murdoch, for their sort of propaganda capacity and potential to help harness the war effort. With Keith Murdoch, his tenure is very controversial and he doesn't stay in that role, but it's an interesting kind of use of press proprietor.
It is. I can't really imagine it in this day and age, but then we haven't lived through a world war, really, any of us. So maybe if, unfortunately, things go pretty bad and that occurs again, maybe we'll see this type of
we'll see where Rupert Murdoch may end
exactly.
up in the second half of his life.
Yeah, that's right. It's quite extraordinary. He's got a lot of vitality for someone in his 10th decade, doesn't he?
That's right, 92.
Amazing. So Menzies has to resign in 1941. He loses the confidence and support of key independents, and really his position in his own party and with the country party is untenable. You say the media was starting to become quite critical of his leadership by 1941. Was that central to the instability and lack of confidence that led to his resignation, do you think?
Yes, I think it was. And Menzies himself was very bitter about the role of the press in his downfall in 1941 and referred to the crapulous actions of the Sydney press. But the Melbourne Herald was somewhat involved in that destabilisation as well.
So tell me about his issues with the Sydney press, because he seems to have more issues with them than with Melbourne, or maybe not. Maybe it's just the press in general. He had a famous disdain for journalists anyway, more broadly, which no doubt sprung from experiences like he had in 1941.
Yes, look, 1941 did leave a very bitter taste in his mouth, but he came to learn through the 1940s the value of having some support from the press. Menzies harboured a particular bitterness towards the Sydney Morning Herald and the Fairfax Press, and he did not have a good relationship with Warwick Fairfax, the main proprietor manager of the Fairfax Group. The Daily Telegraph and Consolidated Press, the other major media outlet in Sydney, I think puzzled Menzies. The Daily Telegraph, under the editorship of Brian Penton, which goes until the late 1940s, is really a complex, small L liberal kind of outlet. It's interested in, it fights against censorship. It's somewhat anti-authoritarian. It sees its role as being to play a kind of oppositional role against the government of the day. It's not as ideologically conservative as the Daily Telegraph that we would come to know as the Daily Telegraph even of the 1950s. It's really interesting in the 1940s, and I don't think, to the extent that Menzies even thought about that and Frank Packer in the 1940s, I don't think he understood the Daily Telegraph and its kind of positioning. So, yeah, there's real challenges for Menzies and his relationship with the main commercial media groups of the 1940s.
After Menzies resigns in 41, he gets together, doesn't he, for an evening with some of the media bosses in 1942. So he's sort of been out of the prime ministership for about a year. And of course, by this stage, he's reflecting on his political future, and the UAP isn't looking like it's in a great position electorally. Can you tell me what happens at this dinner? It's quite extraordinary. I mean, I guess these dinners still take place in a way. We're just obviously not aware of them, but it does strike me as passing strange that you had Menzies and I think was it Frank Packer and key people.
Packer, his business partner.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. And key people from the Fairfax Press. I mean, this was obviously Menzies was hoping that he might be able to drum up some support amongst the media and have a comeback, do you think?
That's right. So by July 1942, the Curtin Labor government is in power, and Menzies invites Frank Packer, his business partner, a former Labor politician, E.G. Theodore, Keith Murdoch and Rags Henderson, the really powerful general manager of Fairfax, to an evening with Menzies. So this is the former Prime Minister trying to get press support to help rebuild him and the ailing United Australia Party. And then there would be other such encounters at the Leveson Commission of Inquiry into the British press. A lot of people then were sort of struck by the level of contact and socialising that took place between Downing Street and the Murdoch press. Here you've got surviving the correspondence with Menzies that was so beautifully filed by his secretary, accounts of these sorts of encounters that were taking place in 1942 and 1943 in Australia.
And you find records, don't you, in letters that Murdoch's writing of his reflections of Menzies at the time. I think you have quoted Murdoch as saying that Menzies remains short of some valuable qualities, which didn't bode well at the time for Menzies.
That's right. I mean, Menzies' collection in the National Library of Australia contains index cards that were kept by his secretary, and they actually document letters that Menzies wrote and letters that were written to Menzies, and also letters that were about particular topics. So I was fortunate when I was writing the biography of Frank Packer that first came out in 2000 to go through these index cards year by year by year and to uncover close to 100 letters that were exchanged between Menzies and Frank Packer. Then there's another collection in the National Library. So this is like an ode to the National Library, which, like all of our cultural institutions, is desperately in need of a sustainable funding model.
Yes, we're all hopeful the budget will show a bit more support to the NLA and particularly the Trove digitisation project. Jim Chalmers, if you're
Indeed,
listening.
That's right. Yes, that's right. There's also the papers of Keith Murdoch and a lieutenant of his, Sir Lloyd Dumas, who was in Adelaide and ran the Adelaide News and Advertiser. So there's a lot of correspondence between both men, Murdoch and Dumas, that has survived in their respective manuscript collections, where you can actually read accounts of their reflections on other press proprietors, but also their political manoeuvrings, editorial decisions, etc. So I really felt a great deal of privilege in the sort of historical research that I've been able to do to read some of these letters. Some of the letters I don't think had been read by historians before. Some had, but certainly the Packer and Menzies correspondence was really news to researchers.
In that material, no doubt, you got a sense of how involved both Packer and Murdoch and other media figures were, I guess, in the development of the founding of the Liberal Party in 1944.
Yes, that's right. The development of the Liberal Party, the rebuilding of Menzies. One of Menzies' negatives in the early 1940s was that he was seen as rather sort of patrician and aloof. So he and the people around him in the Liberal Party really tried from about 1942 onwards to cultivate an image of a more sort of accessible Mr. Menzies. Someone who you could relate to, someone who understood the concerns of the so-called sort of forgotten Australians, the middle-class households. And the Liberal Party discovers in the second half of the 1940s this sort of concept of public relations. And it's partly a concept that is brought in part by R.G. Casey from the United States, but there is an agency that's employed, the Solomon Rubinson Agency, to help boost Menzies' profile. There's a huge investment in the profile of Menzies. There's a very, in the second half of the 1940s and especially in the lead up to, the 1946 and the 1949 election campaigns, there's really an emphasis on Menzies as leader. It's quite a presidential style of political campaigning rather than quite so much a focus on individual Liberal Party or country party candidates or even their policies.
And there's quite a concerted effort in the Murdoch Herald, isn't there, to run articles in the lead up to the 49 election. So there, Menzies is running against Ben Chifley and, of course, Ben Chifley's bank nationalisation policies, which Murdoch's very against, as is Menzies, of course. That Murdoch really pushes all these articles that are building up Menzies personally, aren't they?
Yes, so the newspapers, the Melbourne Herald and its stablemates, is really promoting Mr Menzies, and also the commercial radio stations. The Herald and Weekly Times controlled a chain of commercial radio stations. So there are advertisements for the Liberal Party, but there are not just advertisements. There's actually a dramatised series that is put to air to help boost Menzies, boost the importance of free enterprise.
I guess they're radio advertisements, are they? And they were presumably created on the advice of the PR people, the new American influenced PR people.
Yes.
This fictitious figure, is it John Henry Ostrel, who is a kind of local neighbourhood guy who comments on political issues, but is supposed to be sort of like the guy who lives down the road, isn't he? That's serial right. Is used
Ostrel.
Quite... Yes. But it's used to quite significant effect, isn't it, in this 49 election campaign?
It is, and there's been quite a lot of work by scholars in the last 20 years or so on this really sort of innovative dramatisation.
What I've found interesting too, Bridget, is the uptake in the use by the media companies of opinion polling, which had been a US initiative phenomenon. And then I think it's Keith Murdoch, isn't it? Hears about it and sends a young employee over to America by the name of, of course,
George Gallup.
George Gallup is the American, isn't he, who's undertaking the opinion polling. But, of course, we have Roy Morgan.
Yeah.
We have a young Roy Morgan sent over to the United States to investigate this new phenomenon, opinion polling. And, of course, that opens a hugely influential source of information for newspapers to draw political conclusions and analysis from.
Yes, so it is Morgan, as you say, who established Australian public opinion polls based on the Gallup method in the headquarters of the Melbourne Herald and the Herald and Weekly Times, and began publishing the results of American surveys, and then the first Australian sort of poll using modern techniques of random sampling appear in the Melbourne Herald in October 1941. Politicians could be disquieted by the results of some of those polls, including Menzies, who would call on Morgan to discuss the results of the poll. And interestingly, Murdoch actually thought that reasonably early poll, I think in 1943, actually sort of helped reinforce to him how important it would be to actually unify the Conservative parties, and that feeds just a little bit into the thinking that led to the establishment of the Liberal Party in 1944.
Yeah, and of course, the opinion polling is absolutely essential part of political reporting these days. You can't imagine a lead up to an election without the news poll and other polls. They're essential. But this was a really new phenomenon. And of course, it was a developing science and art, wasn't it? So the early days of opinion polling, you didn't have the rigour around sample sizes and them being reflective of the general population, or at least the voting public.
Look, there's a real sort of professionalisation of political communication in the second half of the 1940s in Australia, and I think that's demonstrated by two things we've touched on today. One is the emergence of public opinion polling and the Gallup method in Australia, and the other is also imported from the United States, which is the concept of public relations and the way in which that industry is used to craft the images of individual politicians such as Menzies, and also of political parties, including the very new Liberal Party of Australia.
What I find fascinating is that Menzies was so close to being removed as leader after 1946. So the Liberals are formed in the late stages of 44. They go to the election in 1946 against the Labor government of Ben Chifley, and they win, I think, 5 seats. They win 5 more seats than they had. So they don't do catastrophically badly, but they don't win. And there's this sort of sense that, well, Menzies still can't win with Menzies. He's just not going to cut it as a leader. We don't have political success if we stick with Menzies. That was a pretty strong opinion amongst media, but also his own political party and colleagues, wasn't it?
That's right. And Menzies himself was shattered by the result of the 1946 campaign.
Bridget, we've talked quite a bit about the Herald and the Melbourne Press and, of course, Keith Murdoch, but I'd love to hear a bit more about Menzies' relationship with Sydney and Frank Packer, because that was, again, a really interesting relationship. And actually, Frank Packer ends up being quite close to Billy McMahon, which is a whole other podcast and story.
Indeed.
Yes. But what was the relationship between Menzies and Packer like?
It was a strange and uneven one, really. In the 1940s, Menzies, I think, knew more, and I suspect felt that he understood the Melbourne Herald and the Fairfax Group more than he did Frank Packer and the Daily Telegraph. Packer had been on the political landscape for not nearly as long as the Fairfax Group had been in Sydney. The Daily Telegraph in the 1940s was somewhat unpredictable politically. By, I think, 1950, Menzies starts to engage more with Packer and I think take him more seriously. By this time, the Daily Telegraph has actually surpassed the Sydney Morning Herald in terms of its circulation, and this is in the most populous state of Australia. So the Daily Telegraph is a rival to the Sydney Morning Herald as morning newspaper. It is selling well. The Daily Telegraph is able to bring to the Liberal Party a somewhat different audience. The Sydney Morning Herald appeals to A and B class readers, affluent readers and households. It's generally delivered to the home. The Daily Telegraph is much more a newspaper that is bought on the streets from vendors, and it appeals more to C and D class readers, so lower middle class and working class readers. So that's really for a fairly new political party that is trying to create a degree of mass appeal. The Daily Telegraph is a very attractive outlet for the Liberal Party. So I think by 1950, and the correspondence that I've seen between Packer and Menzies is, although Menzies I think was still somewhat ambivalent about Packer as a man, I think realises that Packer is a political force to be contended with. And at the same time, by the late 1940s, the Daily Telegraph and Frank Packer are becoming more politically conservative. They're upset with the Labor Party about newsprint rationing. They oppose the plan to nationalise the banks. They're concerned about communist instrumentality in strikes. So you sort of have an ideological kind of shift on the part of Consolidated Press that again makes the Daily Telegraph and the outlets around it as useful to Menzies and the Liberal Party. I think Packer really wanted the respect and affection of Menzies. I'm not sure that he got it. I think that Menzies wanted an ally in the crucial market of Sydney and of New South Wales. And one of the things I think that Menzies may have dangled in front of Packer for a long time is Packer initially is awarded a CBE, not a KBE, so he's not knighted, and he's furious. And for years, he's hoping that he may be sort of recommended in the Imperial Honours for a knighthood, and he doesn't get that until the 1960s. So I think that's almost like a sort of bit of a carrot that Menzies might have been hanging out there for loyal service.
Was that noted at all in public? Was there any sense of derision that Menzies was taunting Packer with that, or withholding a KBE from him?
It's an interesting question. I don't think that even political observers perhaps knew quite how much correspondence between the pair that there was. But when Packer finally does get his knighthood, there was certainly comments made in Parliament from the Labor Party about this being as a kind of reward for services rendered.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine this happening in today's context, but maybe it does. Maybe I'm naive in my reflections. In 1961, the retelling of history would say that he had an extraordinary period of some 16 odd years of continuous service as the Prime Minister, and it was all roses, and Labor Party was splitting and communism was a massive issue, and he was able to capitalise on those issues as well as some very good economic times to have longevity in office. But of course he almost loses the 61 election. And it's interesting, the Telegraph back then so Arthur Calwell is leading the Labor Party, and he's not known for being one of Labor's great leaders or most popular leaders at all. But the Telegraph starts to publish articles by Calwell under the title The Labor View, doesn't it? So it's giving some sort of airtime to Labor and potentially would have had a role in the near-run thing that was the 61 election.
Yes and no. What the Telegraph was doing in 1961 is kind of interesting and not entirely straightforward. So by 1961, there's a national credit squeeze, there's a recession, there's high unemployment, there's less advertising and advertising revenue in newspapers, including the Sydney Morning Herald, which of course is famous for its columns of classified advertising, the so-called rivers of gold. So the Fairfax Group really turns against Menzies and the Liberal Party and the coalition in 1961, basically over economic management. And the Labor Party essentially runs its campaign out of the Fairfax building at Broadway. So now it might seem that Calwell, who was actually a really old enemy of the press and especially of the Packer press, that him writing for the Daily Telegraph was incredibly bizarre. You know, what is the Daily Telegraph doing with this? Packer claimed to Menzies that the more that Calwell wrote, the bigger the kind of political holes he was digging himself into.
Right.
It seems a really kind of disingenuous argument, etc. At a certain point, with the financial pressures, etc., Packer suggests to Menzies that Menzies or the Liberal Party actually pick up the tab for Calwell to keep writing for the Daily Telegraph. And Menzies is kind of astonished by this suggestion and of course doesn't do it. But Calwell, however, does agree to keep writing for the Daily Telegraph because he thinks he's getting an outlet. So the election, 15 seats were lost and the coalition only stayed in office by 2 seats. So as you suggest, there wasn't a sort of uninterrupted flow of kind of political glory. 1961 almost brings the Menzies regime to an end.
But then in 1963, at that election, of course, the party hugely benefits from Alan Reid, who's a Telegraph journalist, so one of Packer's apparatchiks. And he gets a great scoop, doesn't he, with the faceless men of the ALP.
He does. So, that's right. So Alan Reid is lured from the Sun to Australian Consolidated Press by Packer in 1954. Reid, English-born, initially something of a supporter of Labor, was an incredibly influential political figure for decades. He was a master at pitting source against source. He was as interested in the machine as he was in the executive and in the politicians themselves and in the policies. And I guess you could say his interest in the machine sort of arguably culminates in 1963, where he sees Calwell and Whitlam outside a hotel in Canberra where the ALP National Executive is meeting and manages to get a a photograph taken of the leader and the deputy leader of the party standing outside the hotel while the executive is meeting inside. And this leads to a famous photo and newspaper headline, which is called 36 Faceless Men. And that kind of sense of this non-transparent union thuggery power behind the Labor Party is really damaging in the lead up to the election.
Yes, and Corwell's photo in that is particularly unflattering, isn't it? And I think it really is the death knell of his leadership, of course, after then. The 1950s, of course, we see the arrival of television in Australia and becomes hugely popular. Menzies loved town hall meetings, he loved radio, partly could credit a lot of his success for his oratory through the radio and at his town hall meetings, because those were the days when people actually went and saw politicians speak as entertainment, which can't say that would be the case these days. How did Menzies, though, find the onset of television? It wasn't quite his natural home, was it?
No, he wasn't enthusiastic about it. And in 1952, he told a visitor from the BBC that Britain had television a lot earlier than Australia. But in 1952, he remarks, "I hope this thing will not come to Australia within my term of office." I sense that he thought it was probably superficial for show ponies, but in the 1940s and the 1950s, both the Labor Party and the Liberal and Country parties have to sort of deal with this medium that is already gaining increased prominence overseas. So there's various debates, arguments over what form television should take in Australia. Menzies comes to think this is in about 1953, then he wasn't that politically dominant and he didn't like the idea of, if the coalition were to lose office, there only being one national broadcaster in Australia, which could be seen as being under the control of the government of the day, so of the Labor Party. So Menzies actually supports having a sort of dual system like we have in radio, so that there would be a national public service broadcaster and there would be commercial stations. And this, of course, plays into the hands of media mates, because they could see television could be a threat, but it could also be an opportunity. And if they invest into television, then they can build up their empires, but also arrest new competition that could have emerged from completely new players being allowed to take the television licenses that were initially on offer in Sydney and Melbourne.
And this, of course, is where Frank Packer then gets into television through Channel 9, isn't it?
Yes, that's right. So a Royal Commission decides that there's to be 2 commercial television licences in Sydney and 2 in Melbourne. So the ones in Sydney go to Television Corporation Limited, which is led by Consolidated Press. So that becomes Channel 9. And then Fairfax invests in what becomes Channel 7, ATN 7. TCN 9 manages to beat its competitors, so it beats Channel 7 and it beats the ABC and goes to air in September 1956 in time for the Melbourne Olympics.
That's right. And that was really when Australia clearly opens itself up to the world, saying, hey, we're here, this independent country down under. It is amazing to reflect on how the names haven't changed that much and how important the media was to Menzies despite his distrust. He does have this rather tricky relationship with Billy McMahon, and actually his successors also have tricky relationships with Billy McMahon until Billy McMahon finally gets the prize he was always after, which is the leadership of the party and the prime ministership. Tell me about this signed confession that Menzies kept at his desk from Billy McMahon.
McMahon was a notorious leaker and, he was famously dubbed Tiberius with a telephone.
Yes.
So when in 1959 McMahon is Minister for Labor and National Service, Menzies realises that McMahon must have leaked the details of a cabinet discussion over a possible increase in the pension. So he summons McMahon to his office. He interrogates him about whether the discussion that took place at cabinet had been revealed to a politician. McMahon admits that he did do that he simply wanted to let the politician know that this issue wasn't a new one. And so Menzies has a stenographer take notes of, basically record this meeting in the office verbatim, and seals the memo, and he basically tells McMahon that, he's got a note of this private conversation. And so it was like sort of Menzies' insurance against McMahon if McMahon were to leak about cabinet deliberations or leak something that might have been damaging to Menzies, that Menzies had this kind of insurance that he could use against him.
Yes, and doesn't mean that McMahon changed his ways by the sounds of things and kept causing his...
No, and in a sense, Menzies, it seems, didn't actually use this piece of ammunition that he had. And I think there's been some real consternation about why Menzies really indulged or didn't act more against McMahon. One of the suggestions is that McMahon was very good at flattery. I think we all respond to flattery, whether you're Frank Packer, whether you're Menzies, you respond to flattery. And it may have been the case that later in his life that Menzies did regret helping enable McMahon actually get to where he got in the Liberal Party.
Yes, regrets. We've had a few. Well, Bridget, thank you so much for this wonderful discussion on Menzies and the Australian media and the history of the Australian media in the 40s and 50s and 60s. It's fertile ground, and it's wonderful that you have written so much on it and continue to do so. So I really appreciate you joining me on Afternoon Light.
Thanks, Georgina. It's been fun to revisit this research.
That's it for this week's episode of Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute. Please make sure to subscribe and catch up on our latest online content on our website or on Twitter, LinkedIn or Facebook.